She told the police, though only 3 months later, as we shall see, that she heard a child, presumably Madeleine, crying from 10:30 p.m. to 11:45 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday the 1st of May. She says that she then heard a door closing at 11:45 p.m. and then the crying stopped. On the face of it, there is no reason to suspect that this was anything other than the unvarnished truth. Why would an 82-year-old widow lie about anything, especially something so serious? But, as with almost everything in this case, nothing is quite what it seems. So there are 3 elements to her story. 1, she says she heard a child crying for 75 minutes continuously on Tuesday the 1st of May, 2 days before Madeleine went missing. 2, she says she was burgled in the week before Madeleine went missing. And 3, she says on the day Madeleine went missing, her niece, Carol Tranmere, visited her and happened to see a man peering suspiciously into the McCann's apartment. But first, let's notice when she makes her statement. She does so on the 20th of August 2007. That's over 3.5 months, or 111 days since the date she says she heard the crying on Tuesday the 1st of May. So exactly how did Mrs. Fenn's statement, with its dramatic news of a burglar, a suspicious man, and a child's crying for 75 minutes come about? By looking at the lead-up to it, this will help us to form a view on whether Mrs. Fenn was telling the truth or not. Newspaper coverage about Mrs. Fenn in several British newspapers suddenly broke on Saturday the 18th of August 2007. It's strange that the story broke 2 days before she gave her statement to the police. This is what the Sun told us. Their story was headed, "Your sis, Maddie, is missing," and featured the McCann's claim that only now, 3 months after Madeleine went missing, had the McCanns told their twins, Emily and Sean, that Madeleine had been abducted. But the story also made these revelations about Mrs. Pamela Fenn. The Portuguese cops are again under fire. The woman living in the apartment above the McCanns claimed she had not been spoken to by police until the British team arrived 2 weeks ago. Expat Pamela Fenn told them she disturbed a burglar at her apartment about 3 weeks before Maddie vanished. She is now to give a formal statement to Portuguese officers. A friend said she was surprised that neither the police nor the McCanns had approached her before. Pamela also said that her niece, who stayed with her the week Maddie disappeared, spotted somebody fitting the description of a man seen carrying a child away under a blanket. The pal added he was acting suspiciously. I have no doubt that the so-called friend mentioned in this story is none other than the McCann's official PR spokesman, Clarence Mitchell, whose job at the time Madeleine was reported missing was the head of Tony Blair's propaganda machine, the Media Monitoring Unit at the Central Office of Information. In this story, the burglary is said to have taken place 3 weeks before Madeleine went missing, not 1 week as she says in her official statement. The article quotes the friend as saying that Mrs. Fenn was surprised that the police had not approached her before. Surely the much greater surprise is that Mrs. Fenn had done nothing for 3.5 months to report an attempted burglary, a suspicious man hanging round the McCann's apartment, and hearing a child sobbing her heart out in the apartment below her for 75 minutes, 2 days before she was reported missing. The article also says that Mrs. Fenn's niece, Carol Tranmere, stayed with Mrs. Fenn that week. However, Carol Tranmere told the police that she had stayed elsewhere in Portugal and only visited her aunt on a couple of occasions. Another contradiction. Mrs. Fenn's niece, Carol Tranmere, later said that the man she said she saw fitted the description of a man carrying a child away under a blanket. But it wasn't until late October, nearly 6 months later, that the McCann team released this artist's sketch of the man supposedly seen by Jane Tanner. Before then, there was no detailed description of him. The Daily Mirror added some detail about the alleged burglary. It told its readers, Pamela Fenn said a man broke into her flat weeks before Madeleine disappeared. There was no sign of a break-in, and it's thought the intruder may have had a key. She reported the incident to Portuguese police, but they did not question her again. The report went on. Mrs. Fenn, who was in her 70s, found the man scrambling out of the window and tried to grab his ankle, but he escaped. If one looks at all the reports about whether Mrs. Fenn did or did not report this to the police at the time, it is very confusing. One version is that she didn't report the incident at the time, another is that she never reported it at all, another is that she never reported it all, yet one more says that because nothing was stolen, she thought it unimportant, whilst a fourth, contradicting all the others, said she was beside herself with fear and contacted the police. These inconsistencies do not inspire confidence in Mrs. Fenn as a witness of truth, or at least those reporting what she said. But now, how credible is this statement? Found the man scrambling out of the window and tried to grab his ankle. Especially when we see how far Mrs. Fenn's windows were above the ground level. And also considering that Mrs. Fenn was 81 years old at the time, not in her 70s, as wrongly stated in some newspaper reports. The drop from the window of the flat to the ground must be 12 to 15 feet, meaning that he would have likely to have suffered injury if this story is true. But she says nothing about what happened to him after he scrambled out of the window. Did he run off? Did anyone else see him jump and report it? And did she really try to grab his ankle? Did she nearly catch him with her outstretched arm as he was in the very act of leaping out of the window? The Mirror report continued. Mrs. Fenn's information only resurfaced after British police reviewed the case 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Fenn will now be formally interviewed for the first time on Monday. The timing of all these newspaper reports is of great interest. It was in the first week of August that the 2 Springer Spaniels used by top police dog handler Martin Grime alerted to the scent of a corpse and blood in 17 different locations, in their apartment, on their clothes and in their hired car associated with the McCanns. As is clear from Kate McCann's book Madeleine, the McCanns were in a state of panic at this time. I suggest that these stories about Mrs. Fenn were planted in the British media in a fresh attempt to deflect from the disturbing leaks coming from the Portuguese police about the scent of a corpse, and about cadaver odour being found in the McCann's apartment and in the hire car. Did these articles serve an ulterior purpose? If Mrs. Fenn's story about the crying incident was right, then that would surely prove that Madeleine was still alive on the evening of Tuesday the 1st of May, which is part of the McCann's version of events. As is clear from Kate McCann's book Madeleine, the McCanns were in a state of panic at this time. I suggest that these stories about Mrs. Fenn were planted in the British media in a fresh attempt to deflect from the disturbing leaks coming from the Portuguese police about the scent of a corpse, and about cadaver odour being found in the McCann's apartment and in the hire car. The Mail on Sunday also gave us this new account of what Mrs. Fenn said happened when a man attempted to burgle her. They reported Mrs. Fenn scared him off. She told friends she heard a noise as she watched television and found a man escaping through her bedroom window. Her niece, who was staying with her, also saw the man. This is different from earlier accounts in 2 respects. One, her niece Carol Tranmer is now, for the first time, said to have been present and witnessed the burglary. 2, there is now no mention of Mrs. Fenn trying to grab the man's ankle. There was no suggestion or evidence that Mrs. Fenn's flat had been broken into by this man. He is said to have either walked in through an unlocked door, or he had a key or swipe card that would enable him to enter. Why on earth would he choose to dive out of a window 12 feet or more above the ground when he could have simply walked or run back out of the apartment door? The whole story seems questionable. But then, in yet another version of this event, the man is said to have either broken in or climbed in through the window. The British media reports about burglars in Praia da Luz continued. The day after Mrs. Fenn eventually gave her statement at Portimao Police Station, the Evening Standard ran another dramatic headline: "Burglar was on loose at Maddy Resort." The next day, 22nd of August, the Portuguese newspaper Correio da Manhã ran an even more dramatic story titled "Maddy Screamed for Her Father." Now, Mrs. Fenn gave her witness statement to the Portuguese police on Monday the 20th of August, 2 days after the spate of news reports in the British press. Indeed, it almost seemed as though certain people had arranged for Mrs. Fenn to make her statement to the police, just so that 2 days earlier they could generate banner headlines in the British mainstream media about Madeleine. All this news about Mrs. Fenn being interviewed by the Portuguese police was, despite the alleged confidentiality and secrecy of the police investigation, which the McCann so often spoke about. It seems, though, that the secrecy of the investigation was convenient when McCanns were asked difficult or embarrassing questions, but could be broken at will when the McCann team wanted to get their message out. Anyway, despite the so-called secrecy of the investigation, Correio da Manhã was able to give full details of what she told the police. The newspaper said, Mrs. Fenn confirmed she heard Maddie crying for her father the day before she disappeared. This is untrue, because in her actual statement she says the crying was on the Tuesday night, the 1st of May, not the Wednesday night. But later that day, on the Portuguese SIC News TV channel, a very different story about Mrs. Fenn was beginning to emerge. Here are some excerpts from that broadcast. Mrs. Pamela Fenn, the British octogenarian who lives above the apartment from where Maddie disappeared, says she has been harassed by the unwanted interest of journalists and has denied having spoken to the police. She said she didn't have any information about the case. At the age of 81, this quiet, retired British woman seems to have been seriously shaken. After an outburst by her at her hairdresser's, news that she was a witness in the Madeleine McCann case quickly became known to journalists' ears. According to what she said to have told the police, the night before Madeleine was reported missing, she heard a child crying and calling for her father for a long time. The fact that she spends most of the day on her veranda with a view across the tapas restaurant made the police return to the Ocean Club on Monday morning. Detectives quizzed her for about 4 hours to see if she had seen someone from the McCann group leave the restaurant to go and check on the children. Angry at the journalists' questions, Mrs. Fenn denied being a witness in the case and said that what the press was saying was pure speculation.
I have been here 3 months since all this happened. I've never spoken to a journalist. They've written rubbish in the newspapers. I've never even uttered a word. It's all rubbish.
Angry at the journalists' questions, Mrs. Fenn denied being a witness in the case and said that what the press was saying was pure speculation.
I have been here 3 months since all this happened. I've never spoken to a journalist. They've written rubbish in the newspapers. I've never even uttered a word.